Broadcasting now.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our town hall meeting, our COVID-19 communityresources.com town hall meeting. And you know, it's powered by the Center for Closing the Health Gap. We're going to have a really good session today. So we want you to start putting your questions in. If you're on Zoom, you put them in the Q&A. If you're on Facebook, put them in the chat and we'll get them here, because we're going to talk about systemic racism, or some people say institutional racism. We're going to talk about what it is and what the state is doing about it. Our legislators in the state are fighting it and how they're fighting it, what they're doing. So it's going to be a really great discussion. Let me start by telling you that this will be recorded so that we can post it later. And of course, we always have to thank our tech team, John Reichel and Lauren Harden, for making all of this work. So sit back, you can start putting your questions in now. I would like to introduce our wonderful panelists. They are your elected officials. We're starting with Senator Cecil Thomas from the 9th District of Ohio. Welcome, Senator Thomas.
Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation.
Yes, we're so glad you're here. We also have Representative Sedrick Denson from the Fighting 33rd District. And joining us will be in just a minute, Representative Cathy Ingram from the 32nd District. So we have three of our really popular, hardworking state legislators with us here today, and we're going to talk about what the state is doing to fight systemic racism. Renee Mahaffey Harris, the president and CEO of the Center for Closing the Health Gap, is on the call. She said that she'll jump in from time to time. She's also helping with the tech. But I just want to give a shout out to the Health Gap, because they're really the ones who for years have been doing research about racial disparities in healthcare and economics and housing and education, so much information. And I'll see if Senator Thomas and Representative Denson agree with me, but it seems like the larger community, of all races really, didn't pay enough attention until COVID-19 hit, and you saw Black and brown communities being hit the hardest in terms of not just health, but also economics. So let me, before we go on with this discussion, let me have Senator Thomas to just introduce himself and say a few words.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for having me, and thank you all who are on the call with your questions. I want to hear from you all more than anything else. But yes, I'm State Senator Cecil Thomas. I was elected in 2014, took office January 2015. Prior to that, I was a member of Cincinnati City Council for 8 years. Prior to that, I was the head of the Human Relations Commission for 5 years. Prior to that, I was a 27-year law enforcement, a member of the Cincinnati Police Department. And I'm eager and anxious just to hear from you all and talk about this whole issue of racism and the impact that it is having and what we're trying to do at the state to make a difference. So glad to be here. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I look forward to this wonderful conversation. Representative Denson from the Fighting 33rd.
Good afternoon. It's good to be with everyone today. Special thanks to Renee and the Health Gap and you, Councilmember, for having us today. Just a little bit about me. Spent most of my time out behind the scenes in politics, working for Councilman Wendell Young. I was his chief of staff at City Hall for 7 years. Prior to that, I worked for the Hamilton County Community Action Agency, and then went on to a labor-backed organization called For Our Future as an outreach director, and landed at the Ohio Environmental Council. And that's when I decided to throw my hat in the ring to run for this position. Things move fast at the State House. Doesn't even feel like 2 years, but we're coming up on 2 years at the end of the first term already, and a lot of work to be done, but obviously where we are right now is necessary for us to pause and focus on things that we should have already been doing anyway. But I think now is the moment in time for us to actually drill down and, from our policy perspective, do what we're supposed to do. So happy to be here.
Yes, and I was going to say you brought up environmental issues, and at some point we're going to have a program about that because that's a whole nother topic. But we know that environmental hazards tend to affect the Black and Brown communities the most, and I don't think we talk about that enough. So we'll talk about that another time. But I see Representative Cathy Ingram from the Great 32nd District is on. So Representative Ingram, do you want to take just a few minutes to introduce yourself, and then we're going to talk about what's happening in the state.
Certainly. Thank you very much for having me today. Sorry I was having a little trouble logging on. That's what I get for trying to do too many things at once. But I'm pleased to be here. Yes, I am working for the Shrewd 32 and of course for all of the rest of the state of Ohio. In the State House. This is my second term. My district runs from Mount Adams, all of downtown, parts of Westwood, Lower Price Hill, all up that western. It's a boomerang up the western side, College Hill, North College Hill, Sailor Park, Sailor Park, God. Cumminsville, all of that area, North College Hill up through Mount Healthy. So it's a interesting swash that I have going through there. And pleased to be here, like I said, in my second term, have seen some very interesting things. Some things that I said, I knew it. Some things I say, oh my gosh, how did that happen? And so it's always an interesting kind of learning thing. And I don't think that people realize how much work it really is, and that the people before us, I applaud them, who have worked so very hard all of these years and continue to work. And as Sedrick, as Representative Denson alluded to, there is absolutely so much more work to do. And that's with all of us. So thank you for having me, and we'll see what happens as we move forward.
Thank you so much. Representative Ingram and maybe Representative Denson, before both of you joined on, Senator Thomas was talking about voting, and I see there's a question about voting. So just the person who asked that question, we're going to get back to that, and we're going to talk about voting a little bit later. But let's start by just talking about what's going on in the state about systemic racism. And I was just saying, really, the state got it started, and you guys drafted this resolution, which the county and the city have, we've kind of mirrored what it is you're doing. But where are you all? Because you've got two bills. There's a bill in the House and a bill in the Senate. So Senator Thomas, do you want to go first to tell us what's happening in the Senate? I know you said things are going slowly.
Yeah, we have a companion bill to the House bill in the Senate, basically declaring racism as a health crisis in the state of Ohio. And the bill basically speaks to the social determinants that impact the quality of life of people in general, and how racism is the foundation and the root cause of all of these issues of the quality of life. If you talk about health and the social determinants of health, and how the coronavirus has exposed how racism, as it relates to the quality of health, the disparities in health, and that impact when we are faced with a pandemic such as the COVID-19. Then you look at education. We're slowly beginning to see our inner city schools becoming segregated, being mostly African-American. You may see in some schools 1% of the population being of people of the Caucasian race. So we're going backwards, if you will. Then when you talk about housing, the quality housing and redlining and all of how that all is connected to racism. Obviously jobs, the disparity in pay as it relates to the African Americans, so this goes on. And obviously police community relations is a serious problem when it comes to how policing is done in the African American neighborhoods relative to how policing is done in white neighborhoods. But the list goes on. And so at the state level, this whole issue of the resolution is to bring attention to our legislators and then look at resources. How are we deploying our resources when it comes to these areas? Is it enough to just say, well, we'll fund closing the health gap, and we give you enough money, now it's up to the closing health gap to solve the problem? No, We want to make sure that these resources are being properly disseminated to have an impact, not just to keep everything like it is. And so I'm eager to be a part of making this happen. Problem we got though, and I'll close with this, racism is deeply embedded in politics. And as a result, it's hard to get certain members of our legislature to agree that racism is a public health crisis.
Okay, all right. So we're going to get back to that to see how the Senate is handling it. But let's hear from Representative Ingram and/or Denson about what's happening with the state bill.
You want to go, Rep. Denson, or I can go? Actually, this started in Franklin County with Commissioner Boyce, who previously was in the State House as representative. And what we did was take that in the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus, two of our members, our president, Representative House, as well as Representative Crowley, put together with everybody's input, of course, what we call this House concurring resolution that says that racism is a health crisis. Now, it's a health crisis because it was exacerbated by COVID-19. But what we're saying, and if you read the legislation, you'll see that we talk about all these other things that cause stress and therefore illness, and therefore all of these other things are linked. So we talk about the disparities in policing, of course, and that's one of the main things because of the Black Lives Matters and the unrest that are in all of our cities across the country right now. That's the most visible piece of that. But we are also talking about admitting, this is about, and I said to the governor on the phone a couple of weeks ago, this is about finally saying out loud that racism is the root. You know, all those other things that you are seeing are symptoms of the consequences of what racism has done to Black people, especially Black people, but Black and brown people, we'd like to say, all over this country. And so therefore, we have to make sure that you at first admit, I'm an alcoholic, you're a racist, you have done racist policies, you've created them forever and ever, and oh God, can't do anything about it, it's too late. No, that's part of the problem. So in declaring this, and why we brought it as a resolution, it's important for us to start to say out loud, we know we can do better. Because think about it, people have been saying that for decades. Well, we've done Black people wrong, let's do affirmative action. And then they fight it and say, well, affirmative action, well, it wasn't my fault, I wasn't there. Oh no, but the consequences of what was created is still here. And at some point now, we have to unravel that and say, no more excuses. We have to stop that avoidance thing that we do, which is, well, maybe it's not as good as it used to be, but it's better than it was. That is not good enough. So this resolution starts that conversation, and we've got to be very deliberate about how we handle it and how we move forward.
Okay, thank you. And I want Representative Denson to kick in and tell us about you know, what's happening with the hearings. But let me just say, here's a question that I just don't want to bypass, and it's from Janet Oliver. And she wants to know, has the redlining for housing been erased? So, and I'm not sure what Ms. Oliver means by race. We know it was made illegal in 1968, but, and Representative Denson, you have to unmute. But I would say to Ms. Oliver, the effects are still there, but let me see what our panelists have to say about it.
Definitely the effects are still there. I don't know exactly if in what context does she mean that. Is it gone completely, or are we still dealing, how are we dealing with some of the effects of it maybe? Maybe more clarity would help.
Yeah,
but,
you know, I would say, you know, when we're looking at our neighborhoods, for example, when you look at low-income neighborhoods, you can see there, like the rate of home ownership is so low because back when they were redlining, families and individuals weren't able to get loans for those areas. And so the wealth building that happened in white communities didn't happen in the Black communities. You know, home ownership is a big way of wealth building, but that didn't happen with us.
Can I chime in on that?
Sure.
Okay, we're seeing a reverse redlining, if you will. Back in the 60s, redlining occurred where, choice neighborhoods were, African Americans were kept out of those choice neighborhoods, even in the suburbs, redlining in the suburbs. You know, there was a white flight to the suburbs, and when they went, Blacks were kind of left to not even think about moving in this particular area of the city. And the realtors were the culprits by which the redlining occurred. Well, now we're seeing a reverse of that, because redlining is all about choice places to live. And all of a sudden there's this huge reversal of a white flight back to the city. And you're seeing it all and not only in Cincinnati, but all over the country. Who would ever thought you're going to build a stadium, a professional soccer stadium in the heart of a Black community that's been known to be a predominantly Black community for hundreds, well, I shouldn't say hundreds, but decades. And when they built 75, they split the community and destroyed all of that. So what we're seeing now is all of those neighborhoods that were given over to the Black community, Avondale, Bond Hill, Roseline, Walnut Hills, Mount Auburn. Now you're seeing those properties going up in value, and white flight is coming back in, and Black people are being pushed out. So the reverse redlining is occurring. It has all kinds of faces to it, but bottom line is it's redlining.
It's still redlining. Okay.
I'm going to say this. Technically, it's not redlining when you know what redlining is. The red line was, of course, there was also a yellow line, and that was if there were 2 or 3 families. And the red line got to, here's where we will not put the dollars in. And that was a deliberate drawing, and the banks used that. As far as their loans, the rates for those loans were considerably higher, and who could achieve them. You have to remember that once upon a time on our mortgages, you were allowed to put, the owner of a property was allowed to put, and this home will not be sold to a Negro or Asian or anybody, Mongoloid or anybody like that. And so I dare to say that I bet on the books in some of our states and some that that same kind of law still exists, almost like the don't spit on the sidewalk law. So all of that has to be erased. What's happening right now, though, and the unfortunate part is that this gets into the economics of it. It's not so much redlining, and I have a resolution that I'm sending to the House regarding the review of our credit rating agencies as to how our credit scores are and who's reviewing how that's done. Because if you'll see, there's a total disparity in how African Americans, Black folks, and brown folks' credit scores look when it comes to other folks. And then, even if you have a high credit score, it's where you can use it. But let me say this about the housing piece. And I know now, and I'll say this, that to my colleagues, that there is some concern that's come down from one of the other senators regarding the community reinvestment areas. The Community Reinvestment Act was passed in '77, but with laws changing, the Ohio Community Reinvestment Act most recently says that, we have these areas where the taxes are abated. If you come in and build new property, or if you improve your home, you won't be taxed on the improvement, etc. Well, the unfortunate part is that the people who are taking advantage of that are those same people who are gentrifying those neighborhoods, and we're not even paying attention to it. The included amounts that come from the opportunity zones that our president said, well, we're getting to those blighted areas. Well, what they didn't say was, then that's going to be minus those people that live there now, and it's going to be for all those people who plan to move in. And you will see that if you look at the billions of dollars that the state has abated in taxes and those tax credits to those developers, you will see that not many Black folks have taken advantage or can't take advantage of that. And despite the fact that they'll say, well, oh, the rising tide floats all boats. Well, not if yours has a hole in it. And then you have to move to that new area that doesn't get that same kind of consideration. So if you'll notice, we're convincing people, or whoever they are convincing folks who like living downtown, oh, wouldn't you be better off living further out? Don't you want to go to somewhere else in the suburbs? Wouldn't that be nice? And the answer for many people is no, but they can't do anything about it. So the redlining piece is interesting. The consequences of that is still here with the low home ownership, but that's not what's kept us where we are. And you will see, as Senator Thomas alluded to, the prices of the new construction, even though those taxes are abated on $1 million house, they're not paying the same amount of taxes as you are on your $1 million house. The thing is that Black and brown people cannot possibly take advantage. Well, they can, yeah. Don't let me, I know a lot of y'all can afford that stuff, but many people, many people who were in those areas could never afford to move back. So that's the issue with some of that.
Yeah,
sorry about that.
I was going to say to Janet Oliver, you asked a really good question, because there's a lot of discussion around that whole redlining piece. And, you know, so it sounds like it's subtle and it's kind of changed how it is. So maybe it's got, you know, redlining has gotten around those, you know, that 1968 law that made it illegal, but it's still happening. So in some ways. Yeah.
I would like to add in just on that. We should also remember too that we as government entities have created other entities that allow some of this very thing to happen. Because I remember being at City Hall years ago where certain organizations started to show up, and it's like, okay, what are we giving money to this place for? Why does such and such get to use the land bank and all these things? And it's like, well, because the city technically can't do it, but they have a little more leverage to do it. So even when we start looking at that, we have to be careful about every stop along the way of where government has played a role in creating what we're seeing today, because 3CDC is able to do things that the city cannot do. The Port Authority is able to do things that the city cannot do. I learned about some things I'm sure you all know, where there was a time where you could buy a house for $1 if you were going to renovate it in the area. I remember on my grandmother's street, there was a house that cost $1, and the woman, there were stipulations that came with it that you had to renovate. Well, now what that looks like is those blighted homes get put into what we call a land bank, and then they're renovated, but they're sold at a price in our communities that the people who live there can't afford. So we've created—
Rep. Denson, are you trying to say we're old if we remember that?
I tried to say it in a very, very polite way.
Okay.
And you know what, having that historical perspective is really important though. We really need to know what happened before so that we don't fall into that same trap. So that's, I mean, I think that's really important. So now let me say, Marcia Futel, thank you for Marcia Futel. She says, what are the bill numbers, the House bill and the Senate bill numbers for the systemic racism as a public health crisis? Do you guys know those off the top of your head?
In the House, it's House Concurrent Resolution 31, I believe. Is that right, Kathy? House Concurrent Resolution 31. In the Senate, it's 14.
Yeah, 14.
Okay. So can you go back and tell us, you know, Marcia brought us back to those two bills, and there's some great questions coming up about all kinds of things, voting, gerrymandering, but let me just go back to these bills. So aren't there like state hearings going on now? Can you tell us about that? Hearings across the state going on about racism.
There was a hearing that took place in the Senate. We have not had the hearing there were 2 hearings in the Senate. We have not had a hearing in the House. There was some discussion about the committee wanting to take some time during the summer to go around to different places and have the hearing, but we have not been granted one in the House at all. And based on what you're probably reading about the House, we probably won't be having a hearing anytime soon.
You guys are a little busy, huh?
Just a tad. So they are there, but I think that the hearings are and I keep repeating it, it's the most important part of this whole piece of legislation. So as I think even Councilman Sittenfeld alluded to, so this is just not words on paper. And people who have put up the argument, well, why do you all have a resolution when you can just legislate? And my response has been, we've always been able to just introduce bills and put things there, but guess what? They've gotten us nowhere, obviously. So I see that this time around, the public hearings that we're having are the most important, because perhaps for one time, if we can be forced to sit in a room for hours at a time, and legislators have to listen to story after story, situation after situation, and understand all that, perhaps next time a bill comes before them when it's related to something like this, they'll have a different understanding and a better perspective, because we've always been able to put bills out, but obviously that's done nothing for us.
Okay, all right. So let me get to a question from Michael Davis II. This is a long one. And this is directed to you, Senator Thomas. He said, Senator Thomas, you recently co-sponsored a resolution from Senators Craig and Williams establishing a working group that will help give voice to the community's concerns. And he's asking, have you found more interest in co-sponsors from any Republicans? He says, also, will this push continue, and in what other forms in our government, regardless of if the spotlight dims on the vital issue of racism? And he says tackling it from many angles is the key in his mind.
Well, let me say that the wheels of politics move very slow, because you got to remember, this is an election year. And in an election year, those who are running for election and those who are pushing to get those individuals reelected, those members in the Senate as well as the House, they are not going to take on anything that might be of some controversy and push it through the legislature very quickly. One of the reasons we're not getting any additional energy on the issue of declaring racism a health crisis in the state of Ohio is simply because of the delicate nature of this by some who do not want to be having those conversations. You saw in one of the hearings that we had in the Senate where the one member of the Senate said that, I think his name was Huffman, Senator Steve Huffman. He said during the discussions that people don't wash their hands. Could that be a reason why African Americans get coronavirus?
I remember that. Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah.
So
he didn't say people don't wash their hands. He said
well,
maybe colors don't
people.
wash
Well,
their hands.
Yeah, black people. I'm sorry.
Let's be honest.
I'm being straight. That created a significant amount of controversy.
And he's also a doctor, isn't he? I mean, I think that's what made it so bad. That
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
how can you say a whole group of people don't wash their hands? It's like, that just didn't make any sense to me.
So we are pushing to have more discussions, but again, though, I'm not too. I'm very pessimistic whether we'll do any further actions of any significance as we move forward, because we're gonna be going into recess. We're not going to be having hearings in a regular fashion that we would normally have, simply because of the coronavirus, number one, and then there's an election year, so. As I said, members are going to be breaking to go and help campaign to get people elected. So we'll have a lame duck session, probably starting sometime in November, where we'll be pushing bills through. And I doubt very seriously if we'll be able to get the racism issue through, as well as the bill that I helped co-sponsor with Senator Craig and Senator Williams, simply because of the mere fact that we don't have the numbers, number one. We have to rely on the Republicans, and that's very difficult during an election time.
So, so another question about the whole systemic racism resolution. What follows it? This is a question, we get all the time. You're declaring it as a public health crisis, and then what? What happens after that?
Well, is this for me? I don't want to.
Or anybody? Yeah, it's for all of you.
Well, the governor, when we introduced it, one of the individuals we wanted to get support from was the governor. And he was reluctant at first, but then after some discussions and giving him more evidence of how how deep the systemic racism is, he eventually agreed, and he came public with the mere fact that he agreed that racism is a public health crisis. What we intend to do is to allow for a discussion so we can begin to focus resources of the state government dollars, putting more dollars into some of these areas that impact the quality of life relative to health and education and on and on. Right now, we're just doing what we normally do. And obviously, if you do the same thing, you're going to get the same result. And by getting more focus and more funding going into those areas, that's what the intent here is to redirect dollars to have much more of an impact.
Okay, and let me just follow up. There are two questions here about, and I'm going to try to combine them, about wealth building that kind of gets to what you're saying about steps. So Michael Davis is saying decreasing systemic racism includes removing the power and viability behind the act of being racist. And he ends up by talking about investments in Black businesses. So, venture capitalists, investment in Black businesses and how that's an issue. So is there anything on the table to help with, and there have been a lot of folks who've said, they can't get money here for their business. They've had to go to LA, for example, to get someone to invest in their business. So is there any discussion here about how to get investments for Black businesses?
Well, I'm gonna back up just a little bit and talk about, I think I'm unmuted. Yeah, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the doing piece of this. And here again, when the person said, well, what do you do beyond the resolution? Well, the resolution is here again, just the acknowledgement that the racism exists. And so you will find that there have already been quite a few bills starting with the whole policing and demilitarizing the police and banning tear gas. There are bills that have been introduced, and those bills are continually being written. It's not that we're not doing anything because we're on break right now. We are doing a lot of those things. Like I said, I have a bill regarding the review back to Congress for the review the credit reporting agencies, because we see that there are those differences there. Had conversations just last week. Rep. Denson and I were with the Jobs Ohio folks passing out PPE kits, but also talking to them about how we are including minorities. Just giving them kits is one thing, but that $50 million or all those monies that they are making from that, from Jobs Ohio, need to be channeled to our small businesses. And you'll find that some of the small business folks were there at the Urban League the other day. I know that former Senator Kearney is still taking care of a lot of that through the African American Chamber and working with the small business folks. And so a lot of that we are trying to do. I heard somebody talking the other day about the Black banks. There are some. We need to be having that conversation. There was a savings and loan, I think, or a credit union here in Cincinnati. The question becomes, how do we keep something like that here, and how do we create it and allow it to stay? And the unfortunate part is, here again, is we need to be in on the ground floor on the decision making. It can't just be a feel good. We're working with 3CDC and, oh good, look, we're working to get more minority businesses in OTR. Well, that's fine and dandy, except that somebody's putting money in their pocket from the rents that they're overcharging those folks, from the buildings that didn't even belong to them in the first place. So how does that happen without having that conversation and being very honest about being held back, unfortunately? And then it becomes a victim blame. It's like, well, we tried to help them, but they didn't have any banking relationships. That's something that we have to work on, but we're still putting bills out there. We are trying to put the legislation together And there's a lot of it that's on the table right now until we get back in session, which the House was scheduled, we were scheduled to be back in session in September. So I know that we're not, even though lame duck is usually that November time after the election, we are actually scheduled to be back in September. And right now, needing to probably have a new speaker, we'll be back sooner than that to do some things.
Right. I want to go back to what you were saying about it's one thing to get a business going, but keeping it going is a whole nother issue. And
Right.
I know there was a study from UC Santa Cruz recently that said back in February, there were more than 1 million Black businesses across the country. And by April, 440,000 of them had closed. So COVID wiped out a lot of Black businesses. And so that's one thing, having a business and keeping it.
Right.
So that, two different things. Let me ask you too, because here's some questions about gerrymandering. So this is from Eric. He says, what's happening with the House and Senate districts and gerrymandering? And this also goes into a question that I think Marcia Futel gave us, and she was saying, what's the makeup of the House and Senate? I know when Eric was there, and that was up until 2015, there were 10 Democratic senators out of 33, and I think we have less now. But tell us about that. What's happening out there, makeup-wise?
Well, makeup-wise in the Senate, and we lost one Senate seat. I believe it was in 2018. So we're down to 9, and 20. There are 24 Republicans. So we really have we don't have the numbers. It's just that simple. And this is why it's so critically important that we pay attention to the people we vote for, and sending more help to the legislature to bring our numbers around. As far as gerrymandering, we will be, the lines will be redrawn, but we're gonna have to try to work out a plan as to how those lines should be drawn coming up, I believe in 2022, I believe it is. But the courts have said we're going to have to come up with something that everybody is agreeable upon.
Something nonpartisan, right? So it's like both parties together will have equal say in how the districts are drawn.
That's correct.
I would
go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I would add the fact too that not only will our lines be redrawn, but the congressional districts. And I know one thing that everybody's probably paying real close attention to is that 1st Congressional District, which is currently held by Congressman Steve Chabot. And with this whole space that we're in, that there's a huge assumption, if you look back over the past couple elections, that Hamilton County is now blue. And so with this being redrawn, will we have an opportunity to send a Democrat to Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, and I think people know Kate Schroeder is the Democrat who's challenging Republican Steve Chabot.
Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And here again, all of that is based on the census tract, and even within Ohio. So I would say right now, if you haven't done the census, if you know people haven't done the census, it just part of your conversation ought to be to everybody. Go make sure your census is done. Please find those people. Babies, young Black kids, some of our neighborhoods are the very ones who are undercounted. Right now, they are not to where they should be, and so we need to make sure that we do that. But
Tell
that,
us, why
of
is that
course,
so important? I think some people just don't understand why it's so important to answer that census, which takes like 5 minutes max.
5 minutes. It determines how much money you get from the feds as far as some education programs, your municipalities, the county programs, roads, and all of those things. Those dollars are determined. Your senior citizens and how much goes in for them and how much care, all of that is determined by the census count. And that's how they dole out the monies across the country. And so we have to make sure that we are not undercounted. So even things like when people think that, well, our taxpayers, I pay taxes to go to the rec center. No, all of that stuff comes from other monies that come in because of the census count. So we have got to make sure that census is treated like the Holy Grail right now, especially since even in the state of Ohio, think about it. There are 16 congressional seats. Right now, they're talking about a possibility of us losing a seat. If Hamilton County is undercounted, guess what might happen? Instead of us talking about Shabbat in 1 and Winstrup in 2, or even having to be able to deal with 1 and 2, we may only be able to deal with 1, because depending on who's on that committee, if they're not looking toward how we need to be represented, it's quite possible that loss of a congressional seat may come from our coffers. We may have less representation than we are used to, despite the fact that we have Republicans there. We need to make sure that when that line is redrawn, it's drawn to our benefit. And so that makes a difference also.
So people need to take that 5 minutes and answer the census. It's so important for representation and for funding, right? So we absolutely need that. Okay, so here's some more questions. What can be done to enforce the CRA regulations in local banks? And President Trump was trying to do away with that at some point. I'm not sure what happened with that, but there was a lot of talk about letting those Community Reinvestment Act regulations go. But tell us a little bit about that from your state perspective.
Well, see, the Community Reinvestment Act, which is federal dollars, funneled down to the state, then funneled down to the various municipalities. From a state perspective, I'm not sure, and I'm being straight. I don't want to put bad information out there. I'm not sure if if the only thing we can do is make sure the money gets to the local municipalities, to the county, and to the city of Cincinnati, places like that. And unless Sedrick or Cathy, you all may have any further actions that the state can do, but I'm not sure if we have any further actions other than to just fight to make sure we get those dollars down there. I fight for the 9th district. They fight for their districts.
I can tell you from a small business perspective, in this case, just going to the Cincinnati Herald, we love our banks. Our banks advertise and really help to keep a lot of us going. And part of it is because, there are CRA regulations. So, I think that has really helped a lot of businesses a lot in terms of, nonprofits as well. So we don't want to lose that. And that's one thing that whenever they start talking about doing away with CRA regulations, you're kind of depending on the kindness of strangers versus regulation saying, you've got to do this. So that's important. Were you going to say something about that? I can see Renee jumped on the line.
No, I wanted to jump in. Many years ago, I was in banking and I was the Community Reinvestment Act officer for PNC Bank. And, the Reinvestment Act was designed to ensure that banks lended their dollars equally to people regardless of their race or sexual orientation, et cetera, right? And so now we can see the data that tells us that there are disparities in lending practice. Now, bank lending, be it consumer, commercial, residential, are subjective by that loan officer. And so when we start talking about racism as a public health crisis, we have to look at race in terms of how it impacts all of the quality of life factors, as you all said earlier, but we then need to start looking at the root causes, and the data speaks for itself. So if you start looking at the percentage of loans in an Avondale versus a Hyde Park, and you start looking at the makeup of how that decision was made and how, so you start seeing whether or not there's some questionable, because it's all subjective when someone makes a lending decision, a banker makes a decision. So years
That's
ago, there was a lot
that's
of
an important
focus.
point right there. I think
Yes.
that subjectivity
Right.
is the scary part. And so when people think it's all
Right.
objective, it's like you're just checking off boxes. That's not it. You need that relationship with a banker, and that's a big thing.
And so that's why racism as a public health crisis is bigger, it's health in terms of all of the factors, right? And so whether or not you have a home, whether or not you have the economic stability to maintain a business and have any, frankly, generational wealth to invest in that business,
Right.
causes us to be in the place we are in the country. When COVID-19 all of a sudden said, wow, COVID-19 is affecting Black people and Latinx people differently than everybody else, all of a sudden the truth, which we all know, became apparent. And so this notion of calling racism out as a public health crisis is real, and it is more than a resolution. It is about looking at all the systems and structures that affect our daily lives, from our ability and the percent of Black businesses that exist in this country, to the percent of Black people who are able to go to college, to the percent of Black students that graduate from high school with the quality of education that's going to enable them to go to whatever next step in their life they choose. And so race is a construct in all aspects of our life. And so to call it out and to look at the data that supports and has the evidence to say there are significant disparities. The CRA Act really caused the banks to have criteria that would enable them to continue doing business. That means if their rating was not one that maintained the Federal Reserve percent that they needed to maintain, they could no longer purchase other banks. So there were some teeth in it. And so I think this notion of racism as a public health crisis is that what are going to be the policies and the teeth that are put in policy to make sure that we start looking at the inequities and start dismantling the systemic structures that stand in the way of equality and wealth building for Black people and Latinx people in our country. I just wanted to jump in and say that about CRA. I mean, it's a federal legislation that impacts all banks.
Right.
All banks have to adhere. They have to maintain a 1 rating to be able to function as they want to as a bank. And that's information we need to know and understand so that we can look at the data. And then we can start saying to our local legislative leaders and our state legislative leaders and work with you to advocate around, looking at those inequities that persist in the data.
Right. And we have to remember too with that, Renee, is that in those areas, the Reinvestment Act itself, the 77 Act, of course, moved forward. And then when you look at the Reinvestment Act, the areas, that is a little different because they are very targeted, because those areas have been ones that are cited as being deliberately excluded. And the unfortunate part about where we are now is that they're not only trying to do away with those areas, but not until after certain groups of people take advantage of it. And when you look at that, some of those tax abatements and some of those things that are in certain areas, let's take an Evanston. Those numbers, they put those on there for 30 years. Are they still on there? Absolutely. And many people don't know. But look who's moving into those areas. And then we take all of that. And the president, I hear Jan-Michele, you mentioned that the president is talking about doing away with CRA. And his rationale would be, well, we have the opportunity zones that have been created. Well, you look at that opportunity zone language and you look at who's going to be eligible, and you will find that they have created them off of the backs of where there has been that redlining and non-reinvestment and all those other things. And therefore, we've created a new kind of area, but guess who gets to take advantage of it? Not us.
Right, that's right. So, here's another question from Marcia Futel. And she's asking what the state, this is a really great question, what the state, county, and city are doing together in terms of declaring racism a public health crisis. And, I just want to pitch in and say that Senators Wendell Young and PG Sittenfeld and I, who did the city resolution, were just thrilled that you, Senator Thomas, and you, Representative Denson, and you, Representative Ingram, as well as Jessica Miranda and Bridget Kelly, were there from the state, and then county commissioners, Denise Driehaus and Victoria Parks, who did the county resolution. I understand Stephanie Dumas couldn't come, but she was there in support. And so, you know, all of us are together on this issue. And so the question is, how are we going to work together to address it? I can tell, you know, Marcia, we are definitely going to work together. We've already talked about having our meeting so that we can make some plans there. But so does anybody want to pitch in with that?
Yeah, I think really what's going to be critical, you know, words is one thing, but putting action behind those words is something totally different, and that's a much heavier lift. But it becomes a little easier if you got the right people in office. There are going to be folks running for city council. There's going to be folks running at the state level. You know, all of them, the state reps are running now, Cathy and all of them. But the power of the vote, because we got to think long term. And the governor's already said, yes, I agree. Now he's going to be there for 4 years, and then he's going to run for another 4. Now, if we get the right people in place where we can now begin to pass legislation, pass laws to put the right amount of resources behind what we're trying to do, identify the problem and put money behind it, and we can abate the problem. Poverty is at the root of the impact of racism. And we talk about all these folks shooting each other up in Chicago and Black Lives Matter, and they're not showing, that's the talking points from the other side, saying they don't show any concern for their own Black lives. Well, if we look at the root causes of why all those shootings are occurring and put the proper funding behind those education and housing and jobs and all of that stuff, instead of just sitting there saying that a segment of the population is just, they don't care about lives. So I'll stop, but I'm just saying long-term, it's going to be, it can have a major impact as long as we put the right people in office.
Right, there you go. You know, this is such a great discussion. I want to, Dr. Tyra Oldham just wanted to make a comment here about CRA. She said she was on a CRA board and she witnessed loans and the disparity in loans and standalone banks. And she said, you know, that we have to look at access to capital, like there are deeper problems there with access to capital, home ownership, food, and also education. So Dr. Oldham, thank you for that. You know, I promised at the beginning that we were going to get back to this issue of voting, and we only have a few minutes left. So I want to get to the first question that actually came through. And it said, I've seen warnings circulating on social media that the backups are so severe with the post office, up to 14 days, that absentee voters need to plan on having their ballots in by October 20th. And then the person says, is that an issue anyone here is hearing about?
Yeah, I'll be the first to start on that. I had a long, candid discussion with the Secretary of State. He came into a hearing and I drilled him on this whole issue. Unfortunately, he's on board with wanting to do online voting and to create more drop boxes in the community. However, the racism comes into play because he can't understand why other members of his own party will not give him the authority to add more drop boxes and all these other things, even though he has the authority, but he says it's a gray area. And to online voting, the legislature has to pass that kind of legislation. I am very concerned that the post office may not be able to handle the volume of individuals that will be online voting. And keep in mind, Jim Crow laws were the method by which they kept us from the polls back in the years back. Those same kinds of tactics are going on now. The Republicans are not going to just hand over power, y'all, and we have to understand that. They're not going to do it. They're going to find ways. This whole thing about the the voting where you, I skip my mind right now, but cutting the date, the voter ID laws, let's use that for an example, and how that impacts the African-American community and seniors and college students and all these kinds of things. So my point is that we got to be above the fray. We got to really press the Secretary of State to do his job, add more drop boxes for the absentee ballots, and so that people won't stand in line and all these things and be afraid to come to the polls for fear of catching the coronavirus.
Yeah.
But the Republicans,
you know, Senator Thomas, I'm encouraged that you're saying our Secretary of State Frank LaRose is pushing for online voting and also more drop boxes, so people don't just have to go to the Board of Elections in their county, that one location. There'll be other locations, which will make it more convenient. So that's great. Shout out to him on that. So
well, I don't. Before you start to shout him out, though,
okay.
Remember he is just a person who just sent to the Attorney General to ask the Attorney General, Dave Yost, for a ruling on that. And so we've been pushing him real hard. He's also the person who is a proponent of House Bill 680, which 680 will not allow even him to be able to make the decision that there will be that 3 days before Election Day to be able to vote. And so that bill was there. Fortunately, the Senate didn't pass it out of committee. And therefore, if it doesn't pass before August the 3rd, there will not be enough time to get it in and get it in action. But it's still very scary. But he is still asking whether or not Dave Yost thinks that, as the Attorney General, thinks it will be okay for him to be able to add those drop boxes since the language is murky. I'm afraid that he right now is the only person that can make that decision. He should go on and make it instead of asking Dave Yost for an opinion. And we should be pushing him to make that decision and stop asking for Dave Yost to bail him out. Now, this was as of last week.
Okay, and then how are we doing with this whole purging, purging people from the polls so that people show up to vote and they find out, they're off the polls, they're not registered anymore and they have to get provisional ballots, which aren't even counted till 10 days after the election is over. I mean, it's just awful. So how are we doing with that? Any movement?
I would just say that folks just need to check and see if they are or not, because it could happen to any of us. And just to add on to that whole conversation about voting, we shouldn't be pretending that we are going to be able to show up for an in-person vote in November. We should be operating now as though that may not happen and taking this time to let everybody know what that's going to look like, so we don't end up like we could in this very last primary where it was the day before and everybody's confused. But so we don't end up in a confused situation. Our plan B needs to be bold right now. We need to be putting that out there, making sure folks are, one, registered, and two, if we end up with no in-person voting, what that's going to look like and how you get it done. Because as you know, getting the message out to an entire community about something as important as this can't happen overnight.
Okay, thank you so much. We've run out of time. There's a question and a comment that we aren't going to really have a chance to address, but let me just throw it out there, food for thought for later, and we'll have to get to it at another time. But Mary Aguilera said that Jobs Ohio was given at least $65 million for a petrochemical plant that will poison people on the Ohio River, where 5 million people get their water. And so she just says, think what could have been done for small businesses, plus the pollution will continue to wreak havoc on the communities that always suffer the most, and it will make them more susceptible to COVID-19, making closing the health gap impossible. So thank you for that comment. We need to take a look at that issue. And then
that's an example of a one-party rule. That's what we have, is a one-party rule system in the state of Ohio because of the numbers in terms of in the House and the Senate.
Okay, all right. And then Michael Davis wants to know, and we're not going to have time to address this, Michael, so I'm sorry, but it's a really great question. He wants to know House progress with the Ohio Commission on Racial Fairness. They had a report, and he said July 3rd this year, Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor wrote about the Ohio Commission on racial fairness. And he said it was established by the Ohio Supreme Court 20 years ago. And she dived into the need to address the concerns and the recommendations that it highlighted. So he just wondered how's movement there, especially in reference to racism in the criminal justice system. We're going to have to save that discussion for later, but there's just so much more to talk about. We just really need more time. But so thank you for those questions and comments. Thank you, Senator Thomas, Senator Cecil Thomas. Thank you, Representative Cathy Ingram. Thank you, Representative Sedrick Denson. You all are just a wealth of information. And I've got to say, we really, really appreciate the fight, the work that you're doing for the whole state of Ohio. So thank you very much for being here. Our final comments always go to our President and CEO of the Center for Closing the Health Gap, Renee Mahaffey Harris. I'll turn it over to you.
First of all, Councilmember Kearney, thank you for your leadership with PG Sittenfeld and Wendell Young and passing the in presenting the resolution for racism as social racism as a public health crisis in our city, along with our state legislative delegation, who I am so grateful that we have leading us in Ohio. Doesn't matter the numbers. I would like to end with this quote from Frederick Douglass: "Power concedes nothing without a demand, never has and never will." And so as we look to the November election, we must remember that we do have the power, and our power is in our vote. And as we look at this issue of racism as a public health crisis, the more informed and knowledgeable we are, the more that we are going to be able to help our delegation be able to ensure that the advocacy happens at all levels, to ensure that we see efforts to dismantle institutional and structural racism not just be a conversation, but be true action. So I thank each of you. I thank you for your leadership. I thank you, Councilmember, for your leadership. And we all have a large fight ahead of us, but I know that together God will enable us to do it. So thank you, and you all have a great rest of the weekend.
We're going to make a change. That's right.
Fill out the census.
Fill out the census. Fill out your census.
Yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Bye, everybody. Thank you all.